New York City, May 2001. The final encore of Kiss's farewell tour was echoing through Madison Square Garden, 20,000 voices screaming for one more song, one more moment with the band that had defined their youth. But backstage, in the organized chaos of a massive rock production winding down, something was happening that no one in the audience could see. Ace Frehley, who had already removed his Space Ace makeup and changed into street clothes, was walking with unusual purpose toward Peter Criss's drum kit. The Catman was still seated behind his drums, sweat-soaked and exhausted, staring at the Ludwig kit that had been his throne for nearly 3 decades. When Ace reached Peter's drums, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a moment, and then he leaned down close to Peter's ear and whispered something that made the drummer's eyes fill with tears. What Ace said in that moment would remain between them for years, a secret that captured everything about friendship and loss and the brutal reality of what it means when the music finally stops. If you want to understand the real stories behind rock's greatest goodbyes, the moments that happened when the lights went down and the truth came out, hit that subscribe button. This is the story of 2 outsiders who found each other in the chaos of fame and said goodbye in the only way that mattered. The Kiss farewell tour was announced in 2000 as the definitive end of the band, a massive global trek that would give fans one last chance to see the original lineup in full costume and makeup. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley sold it with their usual promotional prowess, positioning it as a celebration of Kiss's legacy and a dignified retirement from live performance. The music industry was skeptical. Farewell tours had become a cliché by 2001, with bands announcing final shows only to return a few years later when the money was too good to resist. But for Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, there was a different kind of finality to this tour. They both knew, even if it wasn't being said publicly, that this was likely their last time playing with Kiss in any real capacity. Peter's relationship with Gene and Paul had deteriorated significantly during the reunion era. The initial excitement of the 1996 comeback had given way to familiar tensions, disagreements about money and creative control, old wounds that never fully healed. By the time the farewell tour was being planned, Peter was essentially a hired employee rather than a full partner in Kiss, a reality that burned with particular intensity given that he'd been there from the beginning, sharing basement rehearsals and van tours before anyone knew who Kiss was. The contract negotiations had been brutal, with Peter fighting for respect and compensation that matched his founding member status, while Gene and Paul treated him like a replaceable component in the Kiss machine. Ace's situation was different, but equally complicated. He'd returned in 1996 on better terms than Peter, with genuine hope that the conversations he'd insisted on before rejoining had created a foundation for healthier dynamics. But by 2001, Ace was struggling again with sobriety, missing rehearsals, showing up unprepared for shows. The demons he'd wrestled into submission in the mid-90s were back with a vengeance, and the pressures of a massive farewell tour were making everything worse. Gene and Paul were already making contingency plans, having a backup guitarist ready in case Ace couldn't perform. Ace knew this, could feel the organization preparing to function without him, and the knowledge fed into his worst impulses. What made the dynamic particularly painful was that Peter and Ace had always been the outsiders in Kiss. Gene and Paul were the creative and business leaders, the ones who'd formed the band and maintained the vision. Peter and Ace were the guys who'd auditioned, the musicians hired to fill specific roles, who happened to become icons in their own right. They'd bonded over this shared status, understanding what it felt like to be essential to Kiss's success, while somehow always being made to feel replaceable. Over the years, through breakups and reunions and replacement members, Peter and Ace had maintained a connection that went deeper than business arrangements. They understood each other's struggles with addiction, with identity, with the specific kind of pain that comes from being valued for what you do, but not always for who you are. Madison Square Garden held special significance for all four original KISS members. It was the New York venue, the place where local kids who'd struggled to get gigs in dive bars had eventually headlined to sold-out crowds. For Peter, who'd grown up in Brooklyn, and Ace from the Bronx playing the Garden represented a particular kind of validation. They'd made it in their hometown, had conquered the venue that represented success to every New York musician who'd ever dreamed big. The farewell tour's New York shows were scheduled as a multi-night run, with the final night positioned as the emotional climax of the entire tour. The shows themselves were spectacular in the way only KISS could deliver. The pyrotechnics were more elaborate than ever, the stage design massive and complex, the set list a carefully curated journey through KISS's greatest hits. Each night, 20,000 fans sang along to Rock and Roll All Night in Detroit Rock City, lost themselves in the spectacle of fire and blood and platform boots and makeup. From the audience perspective, it was a perfect celebration, a triumphant farewell to one of rock's most iconic bands. But backstage, the tensions were palpable. Peter and Gene had barely spoken off stage for weeks. Paul was maintaining professional civility but nothing more, and Ace was increasingly isolated, showing up for soundcheck at the last possible moment, avoiding the group dynamics that had become toxic. The final night at Madison Square Garden, Peter played with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew how fraught the situation had become. His drumming was powerful and precise, his stage presence fully committed to giving the hometown crowd everything they deserved. But anyone watching closely could see something else in his performance, a kind of desperation, a recognition that this might truly be the last time he sat behind a KISS drum kit in front of an audience that loved what he'd created. During the drum solo section, traditionally Peter's moment to shine, he played with particular ferocity, attacking the Ludwig kit like he was trying to prove something to everyone who'd ever doubted his value to KISS. Ace noticed, even in his own struggles, even through the fog of whatever he was using to get through the tour, Ace could read Peter's emotional state. They'd known each other too long, had been through too much together, for Ace to miss the signs. He recognized the performance of someone saying goodbye, and he understood what that goodbye was costing. When the final encore ended and the four members of KISS took their bows to thunderous applause, Ace was already thinking about what he needed to do once they got off stage. There were things that needed to be said, acknowledgments that couldn't wait for some hypothetical future moment that might never come. The backstage area after a KISS show was controlled chaos. Crew members breaking down equipment, security managing the flow of VIPs and guests, management handling logistics for the next city. Gene and Paul typically disappeared quickly into their dressing rooms, the business of being KISS demanding their attention even after the performance ended. But Peter always lingered at his drums for a few minutes, a ritual he'd maintained throughout his time with KISS. He'd sit there in the aftermath, the arena still echoing with residual noise, and just breathe, letting the adrenaline slowly drain away. On this particular night, with the weight of finality hanging over everything, Peter's post-show ritual took on additional meaning. He sat behind his kit, still in his Catman makeup, though the sweat had smeared it significantly. His hands resting on the drumheads, feeling the residual vibration. The Ludwig drums had been his partner through countless shows, the physical instrument through which he'd expressed himself when words weren't enough. Sitting there, he was processing not just the end of a tour, but potentially the end of his identity as the Catman, the end of the thing that had defined his adult life. Ace had removed his makeup quickly, something he'd taken to doing as soon as possible during this tour. The Space Ace persona felt increasingly like a costume he wore, rather than an extension of himself, and he was eager to shed it. But instead of heading to his dressing room or the tour bus like he usually did, Ace stayed in the backstage area, watching Peter from a distance. He could see in his old friend's posture the weight of what was happening, could recognize the body language of someone trying to hold themselves together while everything fell apart. Ace knew that feeling intimately, had lived it numerous times throughout his career. And he knew that in moments like this, the worst thing was to be alone. Walking toward Peter's drum kit meant navigating through the organized chaos of the breakdown crew, stepping around equipment cases and cables being coiled. Ace moved through it all with single-minded focus, and the crew members who noticed him coming gave him space, recognizing something in his expression that suggested this was important. When he reached the drum kit, Peter looked up, surprised. They'd barely had private conversations during this tour, the group dynamics too strained, both of them too caught up in their own struggles. But now, in this moment, Ace was there, and Peter could see in his friend's eyes that he understood. Ace didn't launch into a speech or try to have a lengthy conversation in the middle of the backstage chaos. Instead, he leaned down, close enough that Peter could hear him clearly over the ambient noise, and spoke directly into his ear. What he said was brief, just a few sentences, but the impact was immediate. Peter's eyes filled with tears, his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining composure, and he nodded once, sharply, acknowledgement and gratitude and grief all compressed into that single gesture. Ace straightened up, put his hand on Peter's shoulder for just a moment, and then walked away without looking back. The entire interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it carried the weight of decades. What Ace whispered to Peter that night has never been fully disclosed publicly. Both men have been asked about it in various interviews over the years, and both have declined to share the exact words. But Peter has offered hints, fragments, that suggest the emotional content, if not the precise phrasing. In his autobiography, written years later, Peter references that moment as one of the most meaningful of his entire career with Kiss, describing it as Ace acknowledging something that Gene and Paul never could or would. In scattered interview comments, Ace has characterized what he said as simply telling Peter the truth about his value and his legacy, the things that needed to be said before it was too late. Based on these fragments and the context of their relationship, it's possible to construct a reasonable understanding of what passed between them. Ace likely told Peter that he was the heart of Kiss in ways that had nothing to do with business decisions or contractual negotiations. That Peter's drumming, his street credibility, his genuine toughness that wasn't an act, had been essential to making Kiss real rather than just a marketing concept. That the Catman wasn't just a character, but an authentic expression of who Peter was, and that no replacement drummer could ever truly fill that role, no matter what Gene and Paul might claim. And probably, most importantly, Ace acknowledged that they'd both been treated as expendable by the Kiss machine, but that their contributions were anything but expendable. That history would remember what they'd created, even if the business arrangements suggested otherwise. The power of that moment came partly from who was saying it. Ace wasn't management trying to smooth over business tensions, wasn't a journalist looking for a story, wasn't a fan with romanticized ideas about rock and roll brotherhood. Ace was someone who'd lived the exact same experience, who understood what it felt like to be essential and expendable simultaneously, who'd fought the same battles with addiction and identity and the crushing weight of fame. When Ace told Peter his worth, it carried authority because Ace knew firsthand what he was talking about. It was one outsider acknowledging another, one person who'd been chewed up by the kiss machine recognizing someone else's scars. The timing mattered too. This was happening at what both men believed might be their final Kiss show, or at least Peter's final show. The farewell tour was being marketed as the end, and while industry cynics might doubt the permanence, Peter and Ace had reason to believe this was real for them personally. The relationships with Gene and Paul had deteriorated past the point of likely recovery. The physical and emotional toll of maintaining the Kiss persona was becoming unsustainable. Whatever happened next with Kiss, it seemed unlikely to include them in any meaningful way. So this wasn't a casual backstage comment, but a final acknowledgement. The things that needed to be said before the opportunity was lost forever. To fully understand the significance of that whispered conversation, it's necessary to understand the parallel journeys Peter and Ace had traveled. Both had joined Kiss as professional musicians, filling specific roles in someone else's vision. Peter had been drumming in various New York bands, good enough to make a living, but not a star. Ace had been doing session work and playing local clubs, recognized by other guitarists as talented but largely unknown to the broader public. They'd auditioned for Kiss because they needed the gig, not because they had some burning artistic vision they needed to fulfill. And then the makeup and the characters and the success had transformed them into something neither had quite anticipated. The transformation had been disorienting for both of them. Suddenly they weren't just Peter and Ace, they were the Catman and Space Ace, larger-than-life characters with specific roles to play. The money and fame came faster than either could process, and with it came pressures neither was equipped to handle. Peter turned to alcohol and eventually harder substances, using chemicals to manage the anxiety and dislocation of living a double life. Ace's drinking, which had started as typical rock and roll excess, escalated into full-blown alcoholism that threatened his ability to perform and eventually his life. Both struggled with the fundamental question of identity. Who were they when they weren't in costume? And did that person even matter anymore? Their struggles with addiction had followed similar patterns, cycles of getting clean and relapsing, promises made and broken, interventions and rehabs, and attempts to white-knuckle their way through. Both had experienced the specific humiliation of being too intoxicated to perform, of letting down audiences and bandmates, of reading about their failures in the press. Both had endured the judgment of Gene and Paul, who had their own issues but managed to maintain functional professional behavior. And both had felt the terrible isolation of addiction, the way it separates you from everyone who might actually care about you, leaving you alone with your worst impulses and darkest thoughts. But they'd also both experienced moments of connection through their shared struggle. Late-night conversations in hotel rooms when everyone else was asleep, honest talk about how hard it was and how much they wanted to stop but couldn't. Covering for each other when one was too impaired to function properly. Subtle assists during shows when coordination was failing. Understanding looks across crowded rooms when the pressure was building and the urge to use was overwhelming. They'd been life preservers for each other in ways that no one outside that experience could fully understand, keeping each other afloat even when they were both drowning. After Ace walked away from Peter's drum kit that night, the farewell tour continued for several more months, playing out its scheduled dates across North America and eventually around the world. But something had shifted for both Peter and Ace. The acknowledgement that had passed between them at Madison Square Garden served as a kind of emotional anchor, A reminder that their value and their legacy existed independent of whatever Gene and Paul or the Kiss organization said or did. It didn't make the remaining shows easier, didn't resolve the business tensions or heal the damaged relationships. But it provided a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that carried them through to the actual end. Peter's final official show with Kiss came in 2004, though he'd been effectively phased out before then, with a replacement drummer handling more dates. The departure was handled badly by all parties. Accusations and counter-accusations in the press. Lawyers involved in disputes about money and contracts. But through all of that ugliness, Peter held on to what Ace had told him backstage at Madison Square Garden. The private acknowledgement that mattered more than any public statement or legal document. It became a touchstone, proof that at least one person who'd shared the journey understood what Peter had contributed and what it had cost. Ace continued with Kiss sporadically after the farewell tour, participating in some performances and recordings while maintaining his solo career. His relationship with the band remained complicated, periods of collaboration followed by periods of estrangement. But his friendship with Peter, such as it was, survived in a way his relationships with Gene and Paul didn't. They weren't in constant contact, both dealing with their own issues and living separate lives. But there was an understanding between them, a recognition of shared experience that didn't require regular communication to remain real. The moment at Peter's drums, the whispered conversation that lasted 30 seconds, has taken on almost mythic significance in retrospect. It represents what both men needed but rarely got from Kiss. Simple human acknowledgement divorced from business considerations. Validation that didn't come with contractual conditions. Recognition of their worth as people and artists rather than as components in a merchandising empire. In a career filled with spectacular moments on enormous stages in front of massive audiences, it was a tiny private interaction that mattered most because it was authentic in a world of elaborate artifice. When people discuss Kiss's legacy, the conversation typically focuses on Gene and Paul, the architects and business minds who built and sustained the brand. But Peter and Ace's contributions were equally essential. Peter's drumming gave Kiss its backbone, the street toughness that prevented all the spectacle from feeling hollow. Ace's guitar work provided the musical heart, the bluesy soul that made Kiss songs more than just marketing vehicles. Together, they were the elements that made Kiss feel dangerous and real, not just a calculated product. Their status as outsiders, always slightly at odds with the Kiss machine even while being central to its success, created a particular kind of legacy. They represented the tension between artistry and commerce, between being a musician and being a brand, between authentic self-expression and playing a role. Every artist who's ever struggled with those tensions can see something of themselves in Peter and Ace's journey. And their friendship, forged in shared struggle and maintained through mutual understanding even when external circumstances pulled them apart, represents something equally valuable: the possibility of genuine human connection within the dehumanizing machinery of fame. The story of Peter Criss's final Kiss concert isn't really about the show itself, the spectacle that 20,000 fans witnessed. It's about what happened after, in the 30 seconds when Ace leaned close and said the things that needed to be said. It's about two outsiders acknowledging each other's worth when no one else would. It's about the power of simple human kindness in a business that often has none. And it's about the fact that sometimes the most important moments in a legendary career happen when the music stops and the truth finally gets spoken. Quietly, between two people who understand each other completely.